Welcome back to the second half of our program. Last night, Brian Rose, in his keynote, and all throughout the morning, really, we've had a discussion of how these ancient objects have an interaction in modern spaces and for modern purposes, and they have the power to telescope, to use Brian's words, distant past and immediate present. They mediate. They make a foreign time and land comprehensible by their very modern aesthetic or fascination. And they can help a contemporary viewer temper and access extraordinarily complex and sensitive issues, very much of the now. This afternoon we're going to continue this, and in a slightly different light in the talks that we have. Our first talk is from Phoebe Segal. Phoebe was the first of our collaborators to come to Houston and dive into the collection and files. She asked questions that we were not yet prepared to answer. And she brought the first signs of the future to our project. As she left, Phoebe asked what we'd like her to focus on, and she was greeted with the most frustrating of responses: whatever you think is important. We wanted the objects and the files, the collection to do the talking, and Phoebe has listened. Phoebe's studies took her from Boston University for her BA to Columbia University for her PhD. She specializes in Greek art, particularly Greek vases, and we asked her to focus on that part of the Menil's collection. She is the Mary Bryce Comstock Assistant Curator of Greek and Roman Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where she's curated and written on many parts of the Antiquities collection and co-curated and edited the exhibition Aphrodite and the Gods of Love. Today, she will speak to us on the Menil Vases, the Image of the Black, and 21st Century Museum audiences. Welcome.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I was happy to be the guinea pig. And I'm so delighted to be here, and special thanks to Sarah and Paul and John for everything, including last-minute cell phone charger requests from this disorganized traveler. I begin with a disclaimer. This paper does not have an argument. It is intended to raise more questions than it answers. Today, I will survey a group of Greek vases in the Menil collection and try to provoke a discussion about how American museums approach matters of race and racial prejudice in historical art, particularly art that predates the modern connotations attached to racial differences. As a curator of ancient art, I am interested in whether and how we communicate the most current ideas about racial and ethnic prejudice in antiquity to the general public. This paper constitutes a very small effort to evaluate how much attention American curators and museums have paid to this subject and the potential for the objects I will discuss to spark conversations outside the confines of the Academy. What I hope to do is begin a conversation about how we might accurately and sensitively discuss ancient works of art that depict peoples of African origin in museum galleries, exhibitions, programming, and other modes of engaging the public. In recent years, it has become commonplace for museum professionals to speak self-consciously of the relevance of historical art in contemporary society. We heard about that last night. No pair of collectors pursued the connection between antiquity and the issues of their time more fully than John and Dominique de Menil. Collecting with purpose and connecting with the community, the guiding aspirations of many art museums today, were central to the Menil's mission, and nowhere is this more present than in the connection between their acquisition of ancient works of art illustrating blacks and their involvement in the civil rights movement in Houston, which we heard a bit about from Paul. The concentration of images of blacks is without question one of the distinguishing characteristics of the Menil's ancient Mediterranean collection, particularly the Greek vases, which I will touch upon in a short while. In the preface to The Image of the Black in Western Art, Dominique de Menil wrote, quote, The decision in 1960 to launch a systematic investigation of the iconography of blacks in Occidental art did not proceed from any clear plan. It was an impulse prompted by an intolerable situation, segregation. She continued, "The past is heavy. To face it, to assume it, facts must be candidly brought to light. The making of a more human world requires rigorous studies," end quote. And this could not be more true today. The Menil Foundation funded the Image of the Black project for over 40 years before transferring it to Harvard University, where it now lives under the direction of Henry Louis Gates Jr. and David Bindman at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research. The first volume, covering the art of the period of the pharaohs to the fall of the Roman Empire, appeared in 1976. The essay on blacks in Greek and Roman art was authored by Frank Snowden Jr., a Harvard-trained and highly esteemed classics professor at Howard University, who championed the idea that racial prejudice did not exist in classical antiquity because the Greeks and the Romans did not attributed skin color to environmental rather than genetic factors. Snowden's aspiration for his essay was that it should be a corrective to the narrative that has left images of blacks out of mainstream histories of ancient art, such as the ones we find in textbooks. One of the central questions my paper seeks to raise is, has that situation really changed, even with the monumental progress made by the image of the black and the debate sparked by Martin Bernal's Black Athena in the decade following its publication? Or its initial publication, I should say. The project is ongoing. Further, and more to the point for museum audiences, have museums done enough to integrate narratives around images of blacks in ancient art, or ever given them priority in our collections, galleries, special exhibitions, and publications? The 2010 relaunch of the Image of the Black in Western art occasioned a review of the landmark project's impact and its reception. Jeremy Tanner, who's a British scholar, authored the introductory essay in which he seeks, quote, to update the image of the black for a new generation of readers by reframing its rich materials in the context of recent research on race and racial representation in ancient societies, end quote. While respectful of Snowden's immense contribution, Tanner demonstrates that his assertion that the world of antiquity was a world, quote unquote, before color prejudice, is out of date. Further, he frames Snowden's desire for a parallel society in which blacks were integrated into a predominantly white society within the context of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s, and specifically as a counter to the platform of separatist black radicals. Tanner's main thesis is that while there is no precise analog for modern racism in antiquity, no policy of enslavement, no apartheid, racial prejudice certainly existed, and that in visual representations, racial stereotypes were put to use to demean blacks and others. A group of vases in the Menil collection sparked my interest in this topic. When I visited last March, it didn't take long to notice that for a relatively small collection, coming from Boston where we have 17,000 Greek and Roman objects, there was a high percentage of vases with images of blacks, and Paul was very kind in running a TMS report for me. TMS reports are the lifeblood of all museum curators, and it confirmed what I had observed. Snowden did not include any of them in his essay for the Image of the Black. In fact, most were acquired after its publication, and therefore they provide fertile ground for revisiting some old ideas and introducing new perspectives so that we may present them afresh to museum goers today. In some way or another, they represent the three principal types of images of blacks in archaic and classical vase painting: mythical kings, warriors, and so-called head vases. Numerous studies of blacks in Athenian vase paintings support Tanner's claim that some form of racial prejudice existed, beginning with François Lisserague's L'Autre Guerrier in 1990, which was the publication of his doctoral thesis. Lisserague's careful study of the way in which hoplite armor defined the Greek soldier in opposition to various types of lesser combatants, peltasts, archers, and cavalry, demonstrated the low position of black warriors relative to Greeks. I mention this because three of the Menil vases I will discuss feature images of black warriors. The first is a late 6th century amphora attributed to the Dot class painter. One of those great names we heard about, of the type we heard about from Sue. On one side of the vase, on the left, we find the struggle of Heracles and Apollo over the Delphic tripod, a subject depicted in stone on the east pediment of the Siphnian treasury at Delphi about 525 BCE, and which in the years following became especially popular in vase painting, as more than 175 vases attest. In addition, the subject was represented on bronze shield straps, in marble reliefs, and on a small scale in both gems and coins. And you have a few examples here. And here are some of the vases. As many will recall, Heracles' outrage at the failure of the Pythian priestess to help him cure himself of disease sent the hero into a fit of destructive rage, which included stealing the Delphic tripod with the intention of founding a new oracular sanctuary. The ubiquitous tripod theft scene was not, however, what attracted Mrs. de Menil to the vase. On August 4, 1983, she wrote to Detroit paintings curator J. Patrice Marandel, thanking him for, quote, telling me about the amphora, a side of which represents a black man with a horse. It brings to light an unknown representation of a black soldier, probably a mercenary, with spears, elaborate boots, and a rare feature, a fillet on his head. And I don't know if you can see it, but it's on view in the gallery, so you can go check it out after. Therefore, what some might deem the B side of the vase was primary for Mrs. de Menil. Groom is the other word used to describe the figure in the files, and this is where things become thorny, because groom carries the connotation of labor, something Greek elites look down upon, whereas warrior or mercenary confers a more noble status on the depicted. So which is it? The representation of Memnon, the mythical king of Ethiopia, familiar to many as an ally of the Trojans, is the first African warrior to be depicted in Greek vase painting. But Memnon's appearance usually conforms to that of a Greek warrior, and he wears hoplite armor. In his essay, The Image of the Other and the Foreign Hero, printed in English for the seminal Not the Classical Ideal in 2000, the French scholar Claude Bérard observed that black warriors were not considered heroic. Memnon is not depicted with black features, and black soldiers do not carry the arms of heroes or hoplites. An early example is an amphora, this amphora here, by Exekias, now in the British Museum. Memnon is, however, usually in the company of lightly armed men with features often described as African: thick lips, upturned noses, and short, woolly hair. The Menil amphora, with its representation of an African peltas, peltas is just a warrior who's carrying a wicker shield covered with animal skin rather than a bronze shield, likely depicts one of Memnon's auxiliaries, to borrow Lissarag's word, and acts as a stand-in for the Ethiopian king, or May. If the isolated, lightly armed soldier in fact acts as an attribute of Memnon, the image takes on a heroic dimension, perhaps appropriate to the reverse of a tripod theft scene. The second vase is a bilingual eye cup, a rare subspecies of the drinking cups brought in with mask-like eyes brought into fashion by the black figure virtuoso Exekias, who we just saw in the previous vase. Mrs. de Menil purchased it in 1987 from the London and now disgraced dealer Robin Symes, who claimed that it was said to be from Treveri. That one sentence encapsulates so many of the issues that we've already discussed. I didn't realize when I was writing it. Robert Guy, in Symes' estimation, the foremost vase painting scholar in America, attributed it to Epictetus, a painter known to have produced cups of this type and regarded by some as one of the most accomplished cup painters among his peers, a group of artists that vase scholars call the pioneers because they constitute the first generation to paint in red figure. Epictetus, whose name literally means newly acquired and is often interpreted as proof of his slave status, painted bilingual cups early in his career, about between 520 and 510 BCE. In the tondos of the cups are exquisitely painted kneeling or running figures or cavalry, this extraordinary example that we see here. Back to the Menil vase, we see a running figure. And I should note, just to go back, that the exterior of the cup, which is also on display, is quite plain relative to other eye cups. The focus is really on the tondo imagery. Once again, we find a lightly armed peltast carrying a crescent-shaped shield with a star painted in white for the shield decoration, and red for the full lips and voluminous hair, the two physical traits that lead us to read the image as that of a black or a Nubian, as he is described in the object files. The warrior wears a snug-fitting tunic similar in conception to those worn by Memnon's auxiliaries on the Exekian amphora in the British Museum. Over the tunic, he wears a nebris, a panther skin worn by Dionysus and his followers, an appropriate addition given the sympathetic context for which the cup was intended. And another cup from Poggio Somavilla, so that is also from an Etruscan tomb, features a red figure African running, and here he has a references made to Dionysus through the ivy that is on the shield. Yet a third African warrior vase in the Menil collection belongs to a type known as the group of the Negro Alabastra, which is known in over 80 examples dated between 490 and 470 BC. Painted in black outline on a white ground, probably imitating, these are other examples, probably imitating Egyptian alabaster, these perfume vessels usually feature a single warrior, often an archer carrying a bow. So we have an example from the MFA, one that had been on the market in the British Museum. Usually the skin of the warrior is painted black and the curly hair is painted in outline, and he or she, I say she to foreshadow what's to come, carries a, sorry, I lost my place. Usually wears a non-Greek costume made up of baggy trousers and a long-sleeved cuirass with sometimes a sort of cuirass, chlamys-like overgarment. Often they are situated in a landscape marked by a palm tree, which you see here in the Vastes example in the center, and a stool. Here. A related group of vases painted with very similar iconography depict Amazons in this manner. The Menil vase, purchased in 1979, features a single African walking to the right and holding a bow. He's holding a bow in his left hand and what looks like an axe in the right. Behind the figure is an upholstered stool, and in front is a crested helmet that sort of hovers above the ground line, and a column, and supporting an architrave. And this is actually the only example that I could find of a vase of this type that has a column in this position. So I would love to hear about other examples, but perhaps this could be a point for further research in the future. According to the notes in the object file, the distinguished scholar and occasional curator, Herbert Hoffman, who we've heard about already today, had this to say about the vase when he visited the Menil in 1988, quote, "The black man depicted is probably the squire of the dead man who is signified by the helmet. The palm tree symbolizes paradise, the exotic, Ethiopia. The column stands for the temple home of the gods, an allusion to paradise. And the empty chair is the chair of the divinity within the temple," end quote. Long thought to represent male figures and ascribed either to the realm of myth as followers of Memnon, and that's what Hoffman's interpretation is really alluding to, or read as guardians of the myrrh tree and therefore connected with the perfume trade, Jennifer Niles reinterpreted them in 2007 as representations of black Amazons. Niles points to a group of alabastra that feature Amazons and black warriors on the same vase, including a fragmentary example excavated at Metaponto, as well as this example in Berlin. Christian Survinu Inwood has convincingly argued that palm trees served as symbols of Artemis, and stools are often associated with domestic work. These are elements that would indeed support a female identification for the figures. Lastly, Niles offers Aeschylus's suppliants as evidence for the connection in these years, between 490 and 470, between Amazons and dark skin, and further the ascription by Diodorus Siculus of a North African origin for the warrior queens. If they are Amazons, these black warriors become doubly other, non-Greek and female. The vase types depicting Africans that have perhaps attracted the most attention are plastic vases in the forms of heads, beginning with a long article in 1929 by John Beasley. The Menil possesses two vases of this kind. One is a Janiform Arybalos, which we see here, representing a black on one side and a woman on the other. And the second is an Oinakawe, a similar idea, but only one face used as a pitcher. By the time the Arybalos was made at the end of the 6th century, there had been, especially in East Greece, a robust and varied tradition of plastic Arybaloi in many different shapes: gorgons, animals, heroes, including Heracles, helmeted warriors, and Nubians. A faience Arybalos in the shape of an African head found in Naucratis, which is in the MFA, is a prime example and speaks to the direct contact that took place between Greeks and Nubians in Naucratis in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. In a recent article focusing on two Janiform head vases in the Kemper Museum in St. Louis, and this image is from the MFA, but the subject of that article is the vases are quite similar. Susan Rotroff writes, quote, "Various notions have been advanced to explain the adoption of Africans as subjects for Athenian head vases, but there is no agreement on the social identity of those subjects, and therefore none on the reason they were considered appropriate in vases for the gymnasium and the symposium," end quote. Beasley had ascribed them a solely aesthetic raison d'etre, writing in 1929, quote, "The black man gets in not because he has strong prophylactic properties, nor because he is more addicted to wine or perfume than the white man, nor because there were both perfumes and black men in Egypt, but because it seemed a crime not to make Negroes when you had that magnificent black glaze," end quote. But as Lissarag reminds us, they ought to be regarded as instruments of alterity within the context of the elite institution of the symposium. An often cited quote attributed to Socrates or Thales demonstrates the kind of superiority cultivated and perpetuated by Greek men. Quote, "He often used to say he had 3 reasons to be grateful to the gods. First, because by birth I am a human and not a beast. Second, because I am a man and not a woman. Finally, because I am a Greek and not a barbarian." This installation of head vases, including animals, satyrs, women, and an African, in a new gallery at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, visually instantiates the social hierarchy that defined the symposium. Both the head vases and the images of warriors we saw earlier suggest the uncomfortable reality that in Athenian vase painting, Africans did not function as mere alternatives to Greeks, but rather as subordinates to them. I must confess that my interest in the depiction of blacks on vases really began with a personal experience I had at the MFA, where I am a curator. In 2014, under the leadership of my distinguished senior colleague, Christine Condolian, we opened a suite of 3 thematic galleries of mostly archaic and classical Greek art, an area in which the MFA's collection is especially strong. Homer and the Epics was the first gallery, Dionysus and the Symposium, which you just saw in a photo. Those head vases are on a large banquet table in the center of the gallery, and Greek theater. One of the highlight vases of the theater gallery is an impressive pelike depicting the binding of the Ethiopian princess Andromeda, a scene probably inspired by a dramatic staging of the Ethiopica in the mid-5th century. It also happens to be one of the richest representations of blacks in Greek vase painting in that it depicts an Ethiopian princess, her mixed-race father, and their black attendants. During the installation, it quickly became clear that our brilliant, dedicated, and totally well-intentioned colleagues in the education department did not want us to use any language to describe the physical features that characterize Cepheus and his servants as black, or to discuss the meaning of Andromeda's lack thereof, which is somewhat analogous to Memnon. Can go back to that. We relented not only because one has to pick one's battles amidst a large and complicated installation, and there were other issues like very large craters that had to fit into cases that were not quite big enough, practical issues like that. But also because they were wonderful colleagues, and we knew that they didn't want to offend anybody with any missteps, and neither did we, even though the terms that we were proposing are ones that Snowden uses quite comfortably in his essay. But I have always felt that by ignoring the issue of race, we all missed an opportunity to engage our visitors more deeply in the world of the Greeks. Different museums must approach interpretation surrounding race in ancient art according to their mission and institutional goals. But I hope that that doesn't preclude us from collaborating on a few strategies together. As we have seen, the Menil collection has a preponderance of images of blacks in the collection, but makes a concerted effort, per the Menil's wishes, to keep verbal interpretation in the galleries to a minimum so as not to interfere with the visitor's direct experience of the works of art. And we heard from Nassos earlier about the advantages of that strategy. Other museums embrace interpretation more openly, but perhaps lack the collections to engage the public on this particular issue. And as I have already mentioned, I don't feel that at the MFA we have satisfactorily engaged with the topic of race in our presentations, even though the collection is quite strong in this area. And I did pay special attention to this in some of our, some other recent installations, both at Harvard and at the Met, which I suppose is not so recent, but it still feels quite new. Like us at the MFA, these subjects were not really addressed in the interpretive materials. On a parallel track, discussions of race and ethnicity are still not central to the mainstream narrative of Greek art and archaeology textbooks, despite the existence of excellent scholarship in this area, including by some of our colleagues in this very room. The one notable and laudable exception is Mark Stansbury O'Donnell's recent Looking at Greek Art volume, his discussion of ethnicity, but that is admittedly a book aimed really at methods rather than monuments. So to my final slide. Strategies for the future. One strategy for engaging visitors would be to ask questions while also giving them some of the tools to explore them. So going back to the examples that I raised at the MFA, we might rewrite the label for the Andromeda vase and guide visitors in looking closely at the representation of racial difference in the vase. Then we might ask them what it means to them and why. Another example would be to draw our visitors' attention to the head vases displayed on the banquet table and ask, who is missing? What is the relationship among the depicted? These are the types of questions that I would hope that we would pursue in our installations. Another strategy is to invite thinkers from outside the museum and the field of classical archaeology to share their perspectives on the representation of blacks in ancient art. Offering our audiences the opportunity to confront multiple perspectives on race and racial prejudice in antiquity, and possibly now, could be quite illuminating for everybody involved, and could be particularly useful for discussions of implicit bias, something that the AAMC is addressing in just about a month from now. Another worthy project would be to review the inconsistent nomenclature we use to describe blacks, Ethiopians, people of African origin, something I am woefully guilty of in my paper today. Paul was kind enough to share some of the press coverage surrounding the use of new policies some of the Dutch and Danish museums have pursued or instituted regarding the use of certain words to describe blacks mainly in European paintings. And I believe that there are merits to considering carefully the words we use as long as we simultaneously engage in meaningful discussions about the images. These suggestions for a way forward are by no means complete, and they may be, they probably are utterly naive, but I still think that discussing racial prejudice and how we approach it in ancient art is better than avoiding it. I welcome your thoughts on how best to build upon Dominique and Jean de Menil's momentous beginning and make the current conversation an inclusive and meaningful one. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. And I know you focused on primarily the high Greek classical sculptures. But do you notice sorry, wow, just praises for a wonderful talk. But I'm wondering, did you notice any, we so often treat this topic as a monolith, right? There's one depiction. But did you notice any regional differences or even chronological differences from the Greek portrayals versus the Hellenistic or the Roman portrayals?
I think that's probably something Jennifer will talk about, because I really just looked at it, and I probably should have been more clear about that at a very limited period of time in one meeting. Sorry. So I think your question will be better answered. Okay. Thank you. It's a great question. Yes.
Thank you. That was a great talk. And I don't want to preempt anything Jen is going to say, but is there public programming associated with these vases? Because obviously, I mean, at least for us, I feel that the headlines of the newspaper should dictate the kinds of public programs that we use for our objects. And race couldn't be a more topical issue, especially these days. So the collection is tailor-made for programming that would be associated with ethnicity, with race, and again, with collapsing this distance between antiquity and the modern period. I don't know to what extent that's done in the Menil. I don't know if I'm asking this of Paul or if I'm asking this of you.
I mean, one of my goals for this paper was to build some steam for doing just that at the MFA. Of course, we're gigantic. I mean, the two institutions are so different. We're constantly fighting for attention, ancient art there relative to everybody is. But what I hope is, especially with the support of our new director, who's quite keen on bringing the art of the past up to the present, is that we can build support to do that. So that is something that we will do going forward. Oh, you have a microphone, sorry. Thank you for your comment.
Okay, there we go. So, yeah, this conference is really the first attempt to delve into some of those issues. And fortunately, we had two of the speakers are focusing on the Image of the Black project, so that's a wonderful start. But we definitely have the resources here with local universities to really engage with the students. One of your points.
Right, I didn't mention that, but it was a last-minute addition because we do have so many professors in Boston, especially Becky Martin, who works on ethnicity, to try to engage with the academic community. I also happened to meet Skip Gates on a plane recently. Christine introduced us, and he did say that he looked forward to chatting about my paper and how we could work together to, bring more attention to his project and our project. So that might be something we can share.
Yes.
Did I interrupt you?
No.
And possibly, another strategy would be an exhibition, and that's something that I would hope we could all maybe think about maybe later in the day, is how to build an exhibition that from the ground up with multiple institutions that could address this topic.
Hi, thank you very much. I was just wondering, have you had any voluntary communication from the community about the display of Africans?
Not that I'm aware of.
We occasionally get the letter from people, why isn't there more? What is this? So I guess the same for you, Paul, would be interesting.
Here, take this.
No, I've been here for 2 years and I haven't received a letter. I've engaged the community, working with the local, like Project Row House and TSU, and people in the 3rd Ward and 5th Ward with the reopening of the Deluxe Theater. But the opportunities are tremendous, and action is waiting to be taken.
I think this is a really interesting set of issues for museums to look at. We get questions in San Antonio. We get a lot of questions about, do you have work by African American artists on view? I think fewer questions about, do you have representations of Africans, or how are you dealing with the little alabastra, the head vase, and so on. But it's tied into bigger questions too about how do we engage the African American community? Is art by African Americans or representing Africans the right way to do that? And there are clearly some people who really want that, and there are other people who feel like doing that is kind of condescending, because then you're saying, well, African Americans can come to the museum and look at art by and about African Americans. So there's a lot of tension there. It also relates to questions about the shape and demographics of our profession, as we, we don't have at our museum anyone who is African American in our curatorial department or in our education staff. And so that's a challenge also in trying to encourage a more diverse pool of professionals working in this field. I really enjoyed what you had to say, but I think these are really complex questions to look into.
Well, and that's statistically borne out by the AMC, demographic study, that not only are museum professionals overwhelmingly white, but curators are the whitest of the of the museum professionals.
I don't know if Chelsea might be better poised to speak about this, but in Houston, the Museum of Fine Arts is part of a group of museums that takes part in a Mellon fellowship for undergraduate students that's intended to bring a more diverse population of students into museum work. And it's in my experience of it, it seems like a fantastic program. And I think within the museum and the kind of academic side of this, we ought to really be thinking about that, because to address that issue of diversity, we have to encourage students, and we have to find ways to tell them, yes, this is a field for you, and here's how we're going to support you doing it, and actually put some action behind that.
This whole issue reminds me of the current discourse on implicit prejudice. And I believe we have to rethink the obvious or not so obvious ways in which museums create hierarchies.
Yes, absolutely.
During your talk, I was thinking about whether one gets the wrong message when the very first area one enters focuses on the Greeks and what came before, and then you go to the wonders of Africa. So this sequence may be perceived by some as a sequence in importance, or the first impression may be the one that predisposes for readings that we don't intend, but they may happen. But to go back to the issue of dealing with the issue of racial prejudice in antiquity, it's a very, very thorny issue in the sense that the way this art, this visual culture functions may be miles, at times, may be miles away from what we retroject to it. And I say that because I made an observation, and I'm not sure whether it's correct or not, but I throw it out there for the discussion, that the preoccupation with blacks, especially seems to be more intense in the period of the bilingual. Now,
at the
I
very end
wonder
of
whether
it.
there is a self-reflexive function there. That is, they go from black figure to red figure, but somehow there is a tension there. And by having, let's say, the black auxiliary with the horse, it may be an implicit, a pun perhaps, on the merits.
A visual pun.
On the merits of the good old ways that compete for attention, for the novelty, against the novelty of the red figure. And I'm sure they were talking about these things, and especially they were impulsive about the sensory effect, because using these objects was the out of the ordinary experience that made the symposium, for example, the extraordinary experience that it was. So with such a mindset that the museum somehow has to suggest so that we alienate this world from us. I mean, we want them to come close to us, but there must be a consciousness that we are delving into an alternate universe that, and we often forget how alternate it is because we live in the myth, the origins of Western civilization. But the anthropology of the last 30 years has precisely distanced us and made us look at the bizarreness of this world whose origins we claim so often. So that's my contribution. Thank you.
That was very interesting, and I look forward to talking more about it with you. Shall we hand this over?
I think we have to move on. Thank you, Phoebe. For many reasons, not least of which is periodization and iconography, it is fitting that Jennifer Gates Foster should follow Phoebe Segal. For the story of our project, it's also poetic, as Jen was the final scholar to arrive at the Menil for her research visit only a few short months ago. Still, we gave her the same frustrating answer to write on whatever spoke to her in the terracotta images in the collection. She's brought us a discussion that weaves together the images of Africans in naturalistic and caricature form and highlights the very power of place and context in unraveling these puzzling objects. Perhaps this is because of her close work in ongoing excavations. Her research focuses on the material culture of the Hellenistic and Roman Near East, especially Egypt, where she's worked and excavated for over 15 years. She's currently assistant professor of classics at Chapel Hill and has written extensively on excavations she's been involved with in Egypt, as well as currently finishing a book on the archaeology of borderlands in Hellenistic Upper Egypt. Today, she will speak to us on objects out of Egypt, bronze and terracotta images of Africans in the Menil collection.
Thank you all, and I will briefly again also echo what a great privilege it is to be here with all of you and to be included in the aims that this project has set out to meet. It's ambitious and it's a compliment to your thoughtful consideration of a way forward, and it's already bearing fruit, I think. So thank you all, the organizers. All right, so here's my... Oop, that's not what we meant to do. Sorry, John. Okay, and so
That's right, that's forward, that's back, and that's the pointer.
Okay. Okay, there we go. All right. So among the many treasures that are tucked away in the storage rooms of the Menil are a small but remarkable group of bronze and terracotta figurines and figured vessels that carry images of Africans. These diminutive objects were all produced during the Hellenistic or early Roman era, roughly from the late 4th century BC into the 2nd century CE, maybe slightly later, and many of them likely originated in Egypt. Each of these carries an image of a Nubian or African on a figurine or small vessel, which was meant to carry oil or perfume, a balsamarium in the parlance of ancient pottery studies. Some are made from molded terracotta, others are cast in bronze. And these are objects for everyday use by individuals of relatively limited means, not special items like the vases that we've just seen, but rather objects that were likely used in the home in ritual contexts, or in ritual contexts in the home. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So as we've already heard, the Menils collected objects that carried images of Africans at many scales, and these are some of the smallest and perhaps least prepossessing objects that they folded into their dynamic collection. But they are, interestingly, among some of the first ancient objects that they purchased, classical objects that carried depictions of Africans. They were acquired over a period of some 20 years. The first was bought by the Menils as a couple in 1965, and the last of this type of item entered the collection as a purchase in 1984. Some of these bronze and terracotta vessels and figurine fragments were acquired by the Menils as the image of the Black Project was coalescing and taking shape. And it's clear that they were early and influential aspects of this collaborative scheme as it developed in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. So the subject of my paper today is the bronze and terracotta pieces that they acquired during this time. And I'm going to examine these as a way into the larger issues that the Menil collection presents us with as scholars and archaeologists. And I'm particularly interested in unpacking the material histories of these artifacts, both as residents in modern collections and as archaeological artifacts with their own site-specific and historical narratives. So I'm going to focus on two related frameworks for analyzing these objects. First, we'll begin with a consideration of the ancient context of these figurines and vessels, particularly as products of Hellenistic and early imperial Egypt. So I'll be getting to the context question that we had earlier. What was their function? Why are they decorated with images of African and Nubian men and women? What were the valences of these motifs in the Egyptian and indeed in the larger Mediterranean context during these particular historical moments? Secondly, I'll turn to the archaeological and curatorial context of the Menil objects. As is the case with many objects purchased by the Menils, most of these lack a secure history. They have neither provenience nor provenance. No archaeological find spot can even be surmised for most of them. And some of them have not even the dignity of belonging to one of our so-called heritage collection, one of these older collections amassed at an earlier time. Indeed, all of these objects, and I just want to be clear, were looted from archaeological sites sometime in the late 19th or 20th centuries, full stop. They are all looted. So these have complicated histories, and we'll consider the likely circumstances of their recovery when it can be known, if we can even begin to guess, and the history that these objects do have in early modern collections, particularly in Europe. So given these complex histories, I'll end with some thoughts about what these objects bring to the Menil in its current context, especially as they relate to the image of the Black Project, which is evolving, as we've just heard. So as the first volume of the Image of the Black, I'll stay here for a minute, sorry. As the first volume of the Image of the Black in Western art makes very clear, depictions of Africans were popular in the ancient Mediterranean world, particularly in North Africa and in Egypt. In these lands, sustained contact with interior Africa generated cosmological material reflections on the relationship between African peoples and coastal communities. In Pharaonic Egypt, for example, Nubians were known both as mercenaries in the pharaoh's army, particularly effective soldiers. They were trading partners and powerful enemies, and they were known as one of the traditional adversaries of Egypt known as the Nine Bows. So these are the sort of cosmological enemies that ring the pharaonic state, and the Nubian was one of these images. And so I'm showing you here tiles from Medinet Habu, a site that Betsy mentioned earlier today, produced during the reign of Ramses III, which show a Nubian chief and his wife, and the ethnic depiction, which had valency in the late New Kingdom. So when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, these ideas didn't disappear, particularly the notion of Africans and Nubians as a special subgroup of this population, as exotic subjects of fear and curiosity. So the fascination with the Nubian other, using the scare quotes, that was inherited from pharaonic culture meshed easily with the paradigm of blackness that was a visual trope in mainland Greek art, which we've just heard so much about. So again, this image. These images in Greek culture, of course, were made most famous by the Athenian head vases that we've just heard about, which often juxtaposed an African male with a light-skinned male, often a Scythian, or a female. And again, this is just elaborating a bit on the context for these images, which we've just heard more about. So notions of alterity and physical differences were an important part of the discourse around Hellenic identity, especially as it developed in the centuries before and after the Persian Wars. Africans were not the only race, if we can use that term, that was used as a medium for meditation on Greekness. Phrygians, Persians, even Egyptians were invoked by Herodotus and his successors as didactic examples of what it meant to not be Greek. But Nubians and Africans were distinct in that their physiognomy, rather than their dress, their moral character, or their weird customs, were the central focus of attention. African bodies were a particular concern of ancient writers, and I think we've already heard a bit about that. So the Hellenistic version of this paradigm evolved from real and sustained contact with African peoples via Egypt, where the frontier with Nubia was an active and porous gateway to the interior of the continent. Hellenistic ethnographers and geographers relied on essentialist interpretations of African bodies and African peoples. They believed, for instance, that the intense climate of Africa produced the dark skin of African peoples and caused strange transformations in their physical selves. The classic example of this are the Blemmies, who I show you here, a race of fabulous headless people with mouths in the center of their chests that Agatharchides describes in great detail as inhabitants of the boundary between the Egyptian state and Nubia, as well as pygmies, and this is a more well-known example of this. So these mythical Africans existed alongside direct experience of real Africans, however, in ways that were new and different in the Hellenistic age with its expanded boundaries. So, for example, in Hellenistic Egypt, the trade in African slaves was very famously centered in Alexandria, where Nubians and Africans were brought into the pan-Mediterranean slave market and sold at exorbitant prices. Egypt was known as the main source of this unusual and therefore prestigious human capital during the Hellenistic and early Roman eras, after Egypt was incorporated into the Roman Empire by the conquest of Octavian in 31 BCE. So I think it's reasonable to assert that Africans, although a rare presence in the Hellenistic and early Roman Mediterranean, would indeed have been a subject of interest for reasons both mythical and practical. A continuing fascination with the bodies of Africans is attested in many of the existing depictions of them from this era, as with the sculpture that I'm showing you here of a slave girl recovered at Aphrodisias in Asia Minor, now in the Louvre. Images of Africans in Hellenistic and Roman material culture are part of a well-known trend in the Hellenistic age to engage materially with a broader range of visual forms, particularly construed through the lens of alterity and otherness. The Hellenistic visual repertoire built upon the subjects that fascinated classical writers and expanded it to include the exploration of altered states of mind and body. So just like age, race, and its attendant physical differences were of interest to Hellenistic and Roman artists. They created these images for an elite class of patrons and non-elites who consume these images through the medium of small, portable, and utilitarian objects like the terracotta figurines, lamps, and balsamaria. Produced in Egypt, largely, and perhaps also elsewhere in quite large quantities, these small objects circulated around Egypt and were transported across the Mediterranean, where they were popular as utilitarian household objects or deployed in domestic cult activities. The Menil examples present us with some of the most common types of terracotta and bronze depictions of Africans thought to have been produced in Egypt. The balsamarium, as I've already mentioned, is a frequent form produced in both terracotta and in bronze. The body, and I'll give you some examples here from the Menil collection. The body of the African, usually but not always a male, is assimilated to the form of the balsamarium vessel, and they carry the neck and the rim as a kind of modius or tulip-shaped headdress. So this is, okay, it is working. Okay, so the hollow, the body here, the chest and the head of the individual is actually hollow, and the liquid would be poured through this little crown on the head, and these are handles which are carried on the top of the vessel. So these vary in terms of quality and the affect of the African depicted. In terms of physiognomy, all share qualities that characterize the African subject, as we've already discussed, an emphasis on facial features and hair, which is depicted as round snail shell curls or ringlets. Some wear objects that explicitly identify them as slaves, such as the example here, who wears a necklace. Try this one. Who wears a necklace which identifies him as an enslaved individual. So that makes explicit here, at least for that example, and I'd argue by implicit example the others as well, that these are not simply generic Africans, but African slaves. A related example from the Menil collection is a lamp handle shown here on the right. So this is the handle of a lamp. In the shape of an African, he is wearing a garment which identifies him also as a slave. So scholars have therefore interpreted these objects to be a transformation of the body of an imagined actual human slave with the function of an oil or perfume bearer into a portable, affordable version that performed the same function. So for those who could not afford a slave, an African slave, or who had no direct contact with individuals of this type, these objects were a way to acquire in miniature form a prestige object that embodied the privilege of such ownership. So the figured lamp handle stands in for the body of the servant who, in a rich household, might be tasked with carrying a light for members of the household, for example, while the oil bearer becomes the vessel here in its most direct sense. So the meaning of such objects, as we might imagine, depends on their consumption context. In Italy, or in more distant parts of the Hellenistic world, African slaves were quite rare, making them more precious by virtue of their scarcity. Outside of Egypt, these miniature images might then be seen as emulative objects designed to invoke the luxuria available to the wealthy elite and part of the fascination with Egypt that was such a prominent feature of the Hellenistic and early imperial Mediterranean. So the consumption of these objects in Egypt, however, is qualitatively different from their deployment in the houses of the further Mediterranean. In Egypt itself, Africans, both free and enslaved, were almost certainly more commonly seen, especially in Upper and Middle Egypt. Certainly the papyri supports such a picture, with Nubians mentioned as devotees in temples, as police in the desert regions of the Hellenistic Egypt, and as visible presence in the cities of the coast. So as I'll discuss in a moment, there's also evidence that images of Africans had cultic significance in Egypt that did not necessarily transfer to distant lands. And so I'll say more about that in just a moment. So in addition to the balsamaria, the Menil terracottas also present Africans as grotesques. Some of the examples do. And I use that term as a conventional one in the art historical sense and not in a pejorative way. So this group is comprised of, in the case of the Menil objects, as heads which have been detached from their bodies, though we can imagine that they were complete figures at one time. So we cannot characterize them as they would have existed in their original form. We simply have the heads to look at here. But we should imagine these as part of small molded terracotta figurines. In Hellenistic and early imperial Egypt, small figurines of men with exaggerated facial features and physical deformities were very popular. As with the Menil examples, these figures often had prominent eyebrows, large ears, large noses, and very fleshy lips. And they're sometimes, but not always, identified as depictions of Africans. And this seems to me to be correct, since they share many of the same characteristics with the more naturalistic images that we've just seen on the balsamaria. Now, while these can be interpreted as part of the Hellenistic fascination with deformity and altered states of mind and body, in Egypt, these figures were often deployed as part of domestic cult. Images like these were thought to be apotropaic. They were often depicted with enlarged genitalia, which is both protective and associated with fertility. Heads like these were sometimes also attached to figurines that showed a servant carrying out some kind of task, often wearing clothing that identified them as a cult servant. So for example, on the bottom left of the slide, a small ascos takes the form of a female grotesque holding an amphora, and she can be interpreted as an African servant figurine. These are also associated by scholars with ideas of fertility, thought to be connected to depictions of Egyptian gods of creation and the dwarf-like deity Bes, whose realm of influence was fertility, childbirth, and children. Figurines depicting Africans, such as these examples in terracotta, likely fulfilled a similar function, as I've already discussed, and as representatives of slaves, or indeed in various, or as symbols of fertility, or both simultaneously. So as I've already mentioned, any discussion of the function of these objects should also include a consideration of where they were found, since without that information, it's very difficult to understand how they actually worked in antiquity, how were they deployed. And it won't, I think, surprise you to hear that despite their ubiquity, few objects like these have been recovered from well-recorded archaeological strata. Why this is the case and the implications for our interpretations of these objects is my next subject. So where do objects like these come from? Only a small number of terracotta and bronze objects like these preserved today were recovered from carefully documented excavations. Those that have been found in Egypt come primarily from domestic deposits at sites in the Fayum and a few in the Delta. And both of these are areas which were intensively exploited for agriculture during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. A few examples have been found in graves, and an even smaller number in temples. So these patterns indicate that objects like these were used in the home, especially in domestic cult practice. Because of the rarity of prevenienced examples, dating these objects is also highly problematic. They were produced, we know, from the early Hellenistic period until at least the late 4th century CE. So stylistic analysis is difficult without securely dated examples to demonstrate how style changed over time and space. Very few exist, and as a result, stylistic dating is problematic at best. As for most objects of this type, all of the examples in the Menil collection cannot be dated securely because they were not excavated scientifically. We cannot distinguish between them as Hellenistic or Roman objects. We simply can't. We cannot distinguish whether they were from a particular site or region in Egypt, or indeed from elsewhere, which limits profoundly their value as cultural documents. Society in Egypt changed drastically over the 800 years of the Greco-Roman period, and there were substantial regional differences in cultural practice. So the limitations we face in attaching these objects to a specific cultural moment means we really cannot say much about the nature and context of domestic cult in Egypt, for example, or about the way that Africans were depicted in different parts of the Mediterranean. All of the Menil objects have only loosely purported regional origins, Sicily, Lydia, Egypt, in the files, and the veracity of those attributions cannot be assessed in most cases. So as a result, the value of these objects as sources of knowledge about the ancient world is very limited. Now, it's thought that many of the objects, the small terracottas and bronzes now held in museum collections, were first excavated in Egypt in the 19th century, and this is the default designation which most auction catalogs rely on. During that time, there was a booming legal antiquities trade in the country that was largely focused on recovering papyri. And I'm showing you a slide here from the database of images, which is held by Oxford University, of the excavations at the site of Oxyrhynchus in the southern Fayum. So to give you an idea of the methods that were in place in the late 19th century there. Papyri are ancient paper documents that were recovered in significant quantities at Greco-Roman sites in the Fayum. And these excavations were conducted with the permission of the British colonial government of Egypt by foreign excavators, who were allowed to retain or sell a significant proportion of what they recovered. And this is the system of partage, which we've already heard quite a bit about. So these excavations, and these are two of the most famous individuals who undertook this type of work, Arthur Grenville and Hunt, in the late 1800s. This is their map, which they drew of the site of Oxyrhynchus, where they dug for several years. These excavations paid little to no attention to stratigraphy or context, and they kept no or very poor records of the location at which artifacts are found. This is the only extant map of the excavations over a period of 5 years that were conducted at Oxyrhynchus, which produced hundreds of thousands of papyri and many, many objects. That's a hand-sketched map. That is the best we can do. So while digging in for papyri in these ancient villages of Hellenistic and Roman Egypt, and again show you what that looks like, many other kinds of small artifacts were recovered in these trash pits and ruined houses. The most common were pottery, glass vessels, and figurines, and items like those in the Menil collection. Many of these were not deemed particularly important or valuable and were simply thrown away. Other objects were sold by the excavators or the antiquities authorities to dealers, in many cases the same dealers who were purchasing the papyri. And these were sold as a kind of sideline by these dealers to interested collectors in Cairo and in Europe. So in some rare cases, we're able to connect figurines and small vessels to specific heritage collections that were formed during this time. So interestingly, and this was one of the real treats and surprises that came out of my visit in August, a subset of the Menil terracottas can be traced back to one of the most famous 19th century collections of small objects from Hellenistic and Roman Egypt. Dr. Daniel Fouquet arrived in Cairo in 1881, and here he is, clearly the central figure in this 1891 painting, which was done essentially at his commission. He was a doctor, and he arrived in Cairo after a cholera epidemic to be of service to the French mission there, and he resided in Cairo until his death in 1914. Now, Fouquet is perhaps most famous for his work on the mummies from Deir el-Bahri in the 1890s, and that is indeed the subject of this quite famous painting. They are dissecting and unwrapping a priestess of Amun who was recovered from Giza, and he is the central figure. He's doing the dissection and the analysis of the mummy, but he's surrounded by a kind of who's who of the French mission in Cairo at this time. So Fouquet, while in addition to his interest in mummies and tattooing, he is a very interesting person, sort of a strange man, he was also an avid collector of bibelots and had ambitions to write a history of Egypt based on small trinkets, and those are his words, and he never completed this work. He was in regular contact with the excavators of many of the sites in Egypt, which I've just described, the papyrus excavators, and he seems to have been offered for purchase many of the finest small pieces that were available in the market in Cairo at the time. So in 1889, he opened his collection to researchers in Cairo, and this resulted in several catalogs of the antiquities which he had amassed over those decades. This included his collection of terracotta and bronze pieces. And I'll show you the frontispieces here of two of the catalogs, which were produced by the director of the French mission in Cairo at the time, Paul Pedrozet. In some cases, the catalog entries preserve information about the object's find spot, and so I've given you here just a couple of pages from the publication of the terracottas, which appeared in 1922, and it shows several of the Menil pieces, in fact, and I think you'll recognize this man, and the catalog entries, which are largely descriptive and offer these putative or points of provenience, which I think should be taken with one of the grains of salt, which we've already heard about in previous presentations. His correspondence with several of the most prominent researchers in the French mission in Cairo reveal a very close relationship between Fouquet, the dealers, and the scholars who published his objects. Although in one letter, a very interesting one, Fouquet comments on the changing nature of archaeology in Egypt, and this is written 2 months before he dies in 1914, because it's starting to become harder to obtain interesting objects. His main focus appears to be on the publication of the items in his collection, so he's exemplary in this regard. His collection, however, after his death in 1914, was sold with great fanfare in Paris in the period just after the First World War, around 1922. And many of the less prestigious pieces entered the antiquities market at that time. Certainly the best pieces went to museums in Europe. So after their sale in 1922, many of these items changed hands and disappeared, and it's difficult to reconstruct any chain of ownership, especially given the disruptions of World War II. So in the Menil collection, we have an interesting situation. We have 3 terracottas here outlined in red, which are definitely from the Fouquet collection. And then we have 6 that were sold to the Menils as Fouquet pieces, or analogous to a Fouquet item, but which cannot be verified as authentic to that collection. So we have a situation where we have dealers, some of whom seem to be representing items as Fouquet authentic, and they are not. And it's hard to know whether that's done in bad faith or in good faith. But in any case, there are only 3 which are definite pieces which belong to the Fouquet collection. The 3 authentic pieces were sold to the Menils in a group in 1971 by J.J. Kledgman, a dealer based in New York, along with 2 of the putative Fouquet pieces, which were presented as authentic to the doctor's collection. Kledgman is, of course, most famous as the dealer who sold Dietrich von Bothmer the looted Lydian treasure in the late 1960s after purchasing it from an antiquities smuggler in Turkey. And this was, of course, returned after a prolonged dispute. 4 other putative Fouquet pieces came to the Menils in 1980 as part of a single purchase from Sotheby's in New York, but they are definitely not in the 1921 catalog of that collection. So that's this group of the grotesques down below. Sotheby's did claim that they were authentic to the Fouquet collection, but they are not. So although these are a mix of real and possible Fouquet artifacts, these terracottas very likely should be associated with an Egyptian provenience, although the more specific site designations, which are included in the 1922 catalog, should be treated with some skepticism. So this is the best case scenario among the Menil pieces. While the loss of information about these items is unfortunate, we can at least treat them as pieces with a relatively secure provenience in Egypt, likely produced, I think, by some of these early excavations for papyri in the mid to late 19th century and bought by Fouquet directly from the excavators or from dealers working with the Antiquities Service at that time. The pieces which are putative Fouquet pieces, I think we have no idea. They might have been produced during later episodes of intensive looting during World War II, or indeed sometime in the mid-20th century. It's very hard to know. The other small bronze, terracotta, and stone images of Africans in the Menil's collection have much more problematic and obscure histories. Most were bought by the Menils in the 1960s and 1970s from dealers based in Europe, and it's impossible in most cases to know whether they come from heritage collections like Fouquet's or whether they were ripped from archaeological sites in the 20th century only a matter of months before being offered on the market. Many of the dealers who sold these items to the Menils have problematic reputations, to say the least. One example, a piece, Head of a Black from Asia Minor, which is shown right here, this little guy here, was purchased in 1976 by Dominique de Menil from Mohamed Yagane, a German dealer who famously sold the MFA, the top half of the Weary Hercules, in 1981, claiming it belonged to his mother, who'd bought it in Germany in 1950. The piece, of course, turned out to have been dug illicitly from the Roman site of Perge in Turkey and was returned there in 1991. In a letter, he offers Ms. de Menil the small stone head from Asia Minor, he says, and explains that he has left it in the care of the curator of ancient art at the Detroit Institute of Arts, William Peck, who will send it to her, although it needs to be cleaned. It still had dirt on it. He also goes on to say that if it's not to her liking, she can return it to Dietrich von Bothmer in New York, and he, Yagane, will pick it up from him there. Now, this exchange, while more detailed than others, is typical of the files associated with these small objects. Most objects have no provenance whatsoever, or a very generic one, and the dealers who offer them do so with little interest in providing information beyond the descriptive. No concrete documentation is offered in any case, except for the Fouquet pieces. In at least one case, a false provenance is given for a piece that is said to be part of a large British heritage collection, but my research reveals that this is not the case. It's a false claim. So this is depressing, but the situation is far from unusual with regard to objects like these small terracottas and bronzes. Most of them were almost certainly looted from sites in Egypt or elsewhere in the early or mid-20th century, while others may be legitimate pieces which have been circulating on the art market, deprived of contextual information because they come from these late 19th century papyri hunting expeditions. It's simply impossible to know the difference. In my opinion, the dealers who offered these to Ms. Menil in the 1970s and the 1980s were taking advantage of that very ambiguity to offer a plausible narrative for these objects. And they had clearly little concern about the veracity of their claims. So finally, I'll just say a few words about these objects as they relate to the Image of the Black project. As I said at the beginning of my paper, these modest pieces of art which depicted Africans were acquired by the Menils early in the 1960s. And as such, the Menils' engagement with the complexities of these objects is important to consider. These were early acquisitions. Some of them are included in the Image of the Black volume. Did the Menils care about these other contexts for these objects? Were they aware of them? Did they consider their original purpose in Hellenistic and Roman Egypt? Did they think about them as objects of interest with these connections to late 19th century Egypt, or indeed as the products of illicit digging that destroyed sites? I think they did not. So what did they think about these? And this is certainly a theme which has emerged from conversations with other scholars working on this material, is that the eclecticism of this collection elicits this sense that we want to know what was in their minds when they chose to acquire some of these objects. And I'm happy to be able to say that I have one letter in the files about this piece, the lamp handle, which gives me a very small insight into that. In the file for this lamp handle, Jean de Menil describes his feelings in explicit terms about this terracotta lamp handle. He said, and I quote, "I love this piece. The face is beautiful, and the whole thing is strong yet elegant." And I think this is a wonderful way of understanding what Knossos called the relational aspect of the de Menils' thinking about these objects. It's clear that their interest in these pieces was dominated by a kind of aesthetic response, although aesthetic sounds pejorative, and I certainly don't mean it that way. But it was dominated by this engagement that they felt by the vividness of the humanity of these depictions of Africans, and the opportunity that these objects presented to consider the origins of racism as they experienced it in Houston in the 1960s. Now, to my mind, there's a certain irony in this because it mirrors some of what we find in the ancient Mediterranean response to and deployment of images of Africans in these small-scale objects. Certainly for the ancients who made and used these artifacts, there was an appreciation of the humanity of the subject, but this was intrinsically linked with a fetishization of the aesthetics of race and alterity. And I think we find some of that in the Menils' engagement with this material as well. In the end, this small group of objects highlights some of the essential qualities of the Menil collection, for me at least. The richness of the material, its careful and thoughtful curation, and unfortunately, the limits of its value to scholars who seek to understand the habits and life ways of the ancients who used them and the people, that is, the Africans and Nubians, that they depict. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions, and I've seen him.
Thank you, Jen. This is fascinating. Very, very, very insightful. I have two questions. I find it strange that you didn't mention more recent or perhaps more systematic excavations that would have produced similar items in controlled circumstances. These do not happen, or the devastation was so complete that nobody goes there to continue in pockets that are undisturbed.
That's a great question.
That's one question. My second is regarding these objects in the framework of the Menil's activism. in the 60s and 70s. What was the social life of these objects, and whether they were used as vehicles for breaking the ice of what I imagine must have been, at least in certain parts of the city, very, very polarized conditions?
So I'll answer the second question first. These objects, in fact, the ones that I've shown you here, and there are more. The corpus that I was looking at was about 35, I think, in the end, is what I looked at. So this is just a subset of that. Among that group of 35, many of them were incorporated into, there were many of them in the Small Things show, which was posthumous. It was the year she died or the year after she died, I think. Is that right, John? I can't remember the Small Things, Paul. So there's that. Many of them are in the Small Things exhibit, but that's quite a bit later. In the 1960s and 70s, they were shown some of them were part of the Deluxe show, which was a really important show for outreach to the African American community. And then they were incorporated into a number of other small exhibitions. The 10th Century show, a number of them were in that as well. So they were, I think, the pride of place that they were given in some of these important, carefully selected, community-focused events attests to what the power that they had, both for the Menils as personal objects, but what they felt they represented in terms of a sort of, I don't want to use the term non-elite, but I think there's some of that. These are modest objects. They're small, they're kind of crummy, they are very personal in feel, they're very they make you want to hold them because they really are pocket-sized. They're very interactive objects. And so they're very evocative of people in the past in a way that a vase or some of these really high art pieces are not. And so I think that quality that they had made them both personal to the Menils, and John de Menil's letter, I think, reveals that. But they were also put forward as part of this dialogue with the community because of the relatability of scale and of material. So I think that was a big part of why they show up in a lot of these smaller exhibitions that they did. But that's reading, that's just my opinion. But it seems to be that that's how they're valued as accessible objects for the community. Your first question is a really good one. So why didn't I say, well, this is how we know about the way that these terracottas and figurines were used. They screwed it up in the late 19th century, but now we know. Well, the thing is, they were so systematic and thorough. The Fayum was it's really extraordinary, the scale of what they did. So they were hunting for papyri. So they were looking for mounds of the mounds created by ancient cities and towns and villages that were rich in papyri. And so these are the trash dumps of cities like Oxyrhynchus and Karanis and some of the Dime. And so the Sebakin who worked out there and then the papyrus hunters were really thorough in destroying a lot of these sites. And they were just trying to get as many papyri as possible. So they really went through and destroyed a lot of those. So there's that. So they messed up, what was there in antiquity so thoroughly. But the other thing is that the focus of Egyptian archaeology is very rarely on domestic contexts, and that's just a big picture. And if Betsy were still here, I know she would say yes, that's true. One of the reasons why domestic contexts and Greco-Roman sites are not often excavated is because of the occupation patterns and the way that settlement has worked in Egypt. We have a very narrow strip on the Nile where people have been living. The only places people can live have been the same places people could live 4,000 years ago. So they are living on top of each other. So sites are so deeply buried, even Greco-Roman sites are so deeply buried that they're inaccessible. So in places like the Fayum, which has now more or less been reclaimed by the desert, those sites are close to the surface and accordingly were looted thoroughly in the 19th century. So in point of fact, there's a really excellent little article by Sandra Sendri, a German scholar, on figurines in Egypt, in Roman Egypt, that came out in one of the Oxford handbooks recently. And she says just flat out, we have a few hundred of these from archaeological contexts. So that makes this more tragic. I mean, there are thousands of these figurines which were produced in the 19th century and in the 20th century, early 20th century from illicit excavation. They have been disseminated out to collections worldwide. they would require, in order to make them meaningful, we would require some sort of armature to hang them on that would be derived from a well-excavated material, and it doesn't really exist, and may not exist ever. So that's bad.
I have a question. I'm right here, so I only need a microphone.
Okay.
So many of these are heads, I noticed. Is there a reason in antiquity or now why they have been severed from their head? Is it just because that's a logical break, but then why don't we have the bodies also anymore? Is it because those are the things that they were throwing away because it was not worth selling? Or is there something about disconnecting head from body that has something to do with these images either now or
in antiquity? So the answer is that often the heads are found detached from the bodies. So when we do have them from places like Kuranes, where they were found in some connection to domestic cult space, which is where they seem to have been operative, it's not unusual to have the body and the head separate. There are a lot of intact examples. They don't happen to be part of this collection, but there are quite a few examples where we have connected, complete pieces. So there's sort of two ways to see this, and scholars have certainly thought about the prevalence of the headless figurine. And so some scholars have postulated that there is some sort of ritual use of these that makes detachment of limbs. And it isn't just the head. We also find many of these, particularly examples like the ones that are on the screen now at the top, that the grotesque heads would have been attached to bodies, often, as I said, with enlarged genitalia or other kinds of distinct deformations. And those pieces would often be broken in sort of ways that were kind of consistent, not just with vulnerabilities in the terracotta piece, sort of weak fractures in the body, but in ways that suggest that the breakage was meaningful and was part of how they were used. That is largely conjectural because we just have so few pieces that can be said to be in their original state, but found in situ in some kind of domestic context. It's just a very small sample. But certainly there is, I think it's reasonable to say that the heads were particularly valued and were kept around, and the figurines may have been manipulated in ways that we don't understand. Certainly they were part of domestic cult. That is one thing we can say for sure.
Thank you for a really interesting paper. I'm really interested in the use of these figures and the heads in domestic cult. I've been working on a house in Pompeii where there was an isolated head with these kind of exaggerated facial features that was found in a niche that may well have been related to domestic cult. And when I looked at it, I had no idea what it was or what it was. It was not something I was familiar with as part of Roman household cult, but I wonder if you or anyone else here is familiar with other instances of these kinds of objects related to domestic cult outside of Egypt. Is there other evidence for this kind of thing? I'm really interested. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm familiar with the situation in Egypt. And so what we have in terms of the data for this that makes it clear it's domestic is mainly from Kuranes and from Dime, so Soknapayonnesu, and a couple of other places in the Fayum where we have houses that have been excavated intact with niches, with sometimes painted niches with votive material still in them, essentially, which is great. And they have included this kind of thing. I don't know of examples of this outside of Egypt. In Delos, I know that there has been some work on the figurines there that suggests direct. Many of the figurines on Delos are coming to Delos from Egypt, and they seem to have a lot of the same patterns of types are present there that are represented in Egypt, particularly in the Fayum. So that has led scholars to propose that the Mediterranean-wide trade in these type of figurines was largely supplied by Egypt, and indeed that some of the stuff that shows up in Italy, where it's documented, is Egyptian. That would be easy to figure out if you looked at the clay, which nobody has really done. So that would be a smart thing to do, would be to take a look at the clay. And it'd be very easy to say if it's Nile silt or marl, and if it is, it's Egyptian. So that would be a good place to start, would be to look at the distribution of these types of figurines in Italy. I know that they've been found in numbers in the Aegean. I don't know about their distributions in Italy, but I'm sure somebody does. It's not me.
I think we're reaching that moment in the afternoon where everybody needs more coffee. And so for that purpose, we've built in another break. We will reconvene here at a strange time. It says it on the program, 3:55, very exact. And then we will, to use Nassos's term, have our final triptych of the day. So 3:55, I'll ask you to retake your sheets.